The air in my new house smelled like fresh paint and potential. After a decade crammed into a city apartment where my downstairs neighbor could hear me blink, this suburban palace felt like landing on a new, much quieter planet. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, arms outstretched, and spun in a slow circle. It was perfect: beige walls, beige carpet, a beige kitchen counter that shone with the reflected light of a beige future. But I didn't see beige. I saw a blank canvas of connectivity. This wasn't just a house, it was a server rack with a mortgage. The wall behind me? Perfect for a 12U rack mount, housing the central nervous system of my new domain. The living room ceiling? Already mentally mapped for recessed smart lighting. The front door was just begging for a keyless entry system tied to a biometric scanner. This was my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, my beta testing ground for the glorious, fully automated future. "Hey, boss, where do you want this one?" The voice of one of the movers pulled me from my technological reverie. He and his partner were wrestling a large, heavy box through the doorway. It was marked with at least a dozen fragile stickers, and, in my own frantic Sharpie scrawl, fragile rooters and raspberry piss. "Careful," I yelped, rushing over as if they were carrying a live organ for transplant. "Gently, gently. Right over there, against that wall. Please, that's my entire personality in there. And a few dozen IoT devices." The movers, a pair of burly guys named Stan and Lou, exchanged a look. They'd been heaving my furniture all day, but this box of glorified calculators was apparently the one that required a level of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. They set it down with an exaggerated, feather-light touch. "Anything else, Mr. Peterson?" Stan asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just Alex is fine. And no, that's the last of it. You guys were great." I handed them a generous tip, feeling a wave of magnanimous, new homeowner glee. They grunted their thanks and lumbered back to their truck, leaving me alone in my glorious beige kingdom. I was just starting to unpack my precious box of electronics when I heard the faintest, most unnerving sound. It was the whisper, quiet crunch of sensible shoes on a perfectly manicured lawn. I glanced out the front window and saw her. She appeared as if summoned by the sound of a box being put down too loudly, a specter of suburban order gliding across the grass. She was a woman in her 50s, dressed in crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt the color of weak tea. Her blonde hair was a perfectly coiffed helmet, an aerodynamic marvel that could likely withstand a Category 3 hurricane without a single strand falling out of place. In her hands, she carried a welcome basket. It looked less like a gift and more like a prop. I opened the door before she could ring the non-smart, and therefore deeply offensive, doorbell. "Hi there," I said, trying for a friendly, non-threatening smile. Her own smile was a work of art, a brilliant, toothy display that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were busy. They were scanning my slightly too long hair, my t-shirt with a witty C++ joke on it, the open door of my beat-up cargo van. I could almost see a mental checklist being ticked off in her head. Unkempt, eccentric, potential source of chaos. "Welcome to the Meadows," she chirped, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "We're so thrilled to have you. I'm Brenda Butterfield, the HOA president." She thrust the basket at me. I took it, peering inside. There was a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider, a single cellophane-wrapped muffin, and a document so thick it could have stopped a bullet. It was bound with one of those heavy-duty black metal clips. "I've brought you a little something," she continued, gesturing to the basket, "and a copy of our community covenants. It's light reading, all 278 pages of it." "Oh, wow. Thanks," I said, the weight of the binder pulling my arm down. "That's comprehensive." "We believe that clear guidelines make for happy neighbors," she said, her smile tightening just a fraction. It covers everything from approved mailbox colors to the maximum allowable blade height for your lawn. We're a Zone 7B, so a fescue blend does best. No more than 3 inches, no less than 2.5. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. She was deadly serious. I felt a cold dread begin to seep into the warm glow of my new home bliss. I had mentally dubbed the binder the Necronomicon of neighborhood nonsense, and I was already certain it was cursed. Right. Well, I'll definitely give that a read, I lied. Brenda's eyes flickered to the side of my house, where the cable and fiber lines ran into a small, gray utility box. It was a brief, almost imperceptible glance, but it felt strangely significant, like a predator noting a weakness in its prey. Wonderful, she said, her mission apparently complete. We have a monthly community potluck. You'll get the email. Do try to come. It's a great way to integrate. And with that, she turned and glided back across my lawn, leaving me standing in my doorway holding a single muffin and a book of rules that probably outlawed fun. I closed the door, the smell of fresh paint suddenly feeling less like potential and more like primer on a prison cell. It took exactly 48 hours for the first shot to be fired across the bow. It arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet ping of an incoming email. The subject line was stark and capitalized. Notice of violation. Attached was a PDF, professionally formatted, complete with the HOA logo, a serene-looking willow tree that now seemed deeply ironic. My crime? The installation of my new smart doorbell. It was a sleek, minimalist device, dark gray, rectangular, with a single glowing blue button. It was beautiful. It was functional. It was apparently an affront to God and man. I read the violation aloud to the empty room, my voice dripping with disbelief. Per Bylaw 17, subsection B, paragraph 4. All forward-facing hardware, including but not limited to doorknobs, knockers, and doorbell surrounds, must be of a brushed bronze finish and circular in design. I looked at my elegant, futuristic doorbell, then back at the email. Who is this for? I muttered. The steam-powered Victorians? Does the brushed bronze have to be smelted by artisanal monks? My first instinct was to rip the thing off the wall and replace it with the dumbest, loudest, most obnoxious brass bell I could find. But no, I was a rational adult. I would be a good neighbor. I composed a polite, logical email to Brenda. Subject, Notice of violation, doorbell. Hi Brenda, thanks for the heads up. I've just installed this doorbell, and while I understand it doesn't meet the brushed bronze requirement, it's a significant security feature. It has a motion-activated camera that records anyone who approaches the house, which adds to the safety of not just my home, but the entire street. Given its security benefits, I was hoping an exception could be made. Best, Alex Peterson, 112 Willow Creek Lane. Her reply came back in under 5 minutes. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a digital smile with a knife hidden behind it. Subject, Notice of violation, doorbell. Dear Alex, thank you for your prompt reply. We certainly appreciate your enthusiasm for neighborhood security. However, the aesthetic uniformity of the meadows is one of our community's most valuable assets. The bylaws are in place to protect that asset for all residents. As stated in Bylaw 17, subsection B, paragraph 4, the requirement for brushed bronze hardware is non-negotiable. Allowing exceptions, even for well-intentioned reasons, would set a precedent that could erode the very standards we all agreed to uphold upon purchasing our homes. You have 14 days to bring the property into compliance. Failure to do so will result in a daily fine of $25. Have a wonderful day. Brenda Butterfield, President, the Meadows HOA. I stared at the screen, my blood pressure climbing. Erode the standards? It's a doorbell, not a dam. But I knew a brick wall when I saw one. I sighed, defeated, and ordered a circular, brushed bronze monstrosity from the internet that looked like it belonged on a submarine. One point to Brenda. The doorbell was a minor skirmish. The real battle, I knew, would be over the data. My job involves transferring massive multi-gigabyte files to and from a secure server. The neighborhood's only internet provider offered speeds that were, to put it charitably, pathetic. It was like trying to drink a milkshake through a coffee stirrer. My solution was already sitting in a box in the garage, a discreet but powerful high-gain satellite dish. My plan was to mount it on a low-profile section of the roof, tucked away behind the chimney where it would be virtually invisible from the street. It was my ticket to the glorious, unrestricted information superhighway. This time, I did my homework. I spent an entire evening with the Necronomicon, a highlighter, and a bottle of whiskey. I scoured all 278 pages. There were excruciatingly detailed rules about fences, sheds, bird baths, solar panels, and even the chemical composition of approved lawn fertilizers. But the binder was strangely, beautifully silent on the topic of personal data uplinks, or satellite transmission arrays. I'd found a loophole, a glorious, gaping loophole. A tiny, Brenda-shaped voice in the back of my head whispered, "Absence of a rule is not permission." "Maybe not," I muttered back to the empty room, taking a triumphant swig of whiskey. "But it's enough for plausible deniability." The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The call was a big one, the kind of call that could make or break a quarter. I was in my home office, staring at a screen filled with the faces of my boss, his boss, and a handful of very important clients from a very important company. We were finalizing a multi-million-dollar data migration project, and I was the lead tech. The pressure was immense. "The integrity of the transfer is paramount," the lead client, a severe-looking man named Mr. Sterling, was saying. "We can't afford a single dropped packet." "Absolutely," I said, leaning into my microphone with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "We've built in multiple redundancies. The real bottleneck was latency, but I've figured out a solution. So if we just reroute the data through the secondary server in the Virginia hub, we should see a latency drop of at least—" My screen froze. Mr. Sterling's face was stuck in an expression of mild skepticism. My boss's face was a pixelated blur of encouragement. The progress bar on the test file transfer I was sharing was motionless. Then, everything went black. "No connection." No, I whispered, clicking frantically. I checked the Wi-Fi icon. A little yellow triangle of doom. I glanced at my phone. No service. Of course. My cell signal booster was routed through my home network. Silence. The kind of profound, absolute silence that only happens when every single device that connects you to the outside world simultaneously dies. It was the digital apocalypse, happening right here in my beige-carpeted office. My mind raced. A squirrel chewing a wire? A citywide outage? Then, a flicker of movement outside my window caught my eye. I peered through the blinds, my heart pounding. And there she was, Brenda Butterfield. She was walking briskly away from the side of my house, away from the gray utility box where my fiber optic line connected to the main grid. In her right hand, she was holding a pair of large, heavy-duty wire cutters, the kind you use for trimming thick branches, or, apparently, for severing high-speed data connections. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She had a look of triumphant finality on her face, the serene expression of a zealot who has just purged the world of a great evil. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage, hot and white and utterly consuming, washed over me. It was so intense I felt my vision tunnel. "She didn't," I whispered. My voice was trembling. "Oh, she absolutely, positively did." I have no memory of crossing the room. One moment I was staring out the window, paralyzed with fury, and the next I was flinging my front door open with enough force to rattle the hideous, bronze-compliant door knocker. I was a primal scream compressed into human form, ready to unleash a torrent of fury that would curdle the milk in her refrigerator and violate at least 17 HOA bylaws regarding noise levels. I took 2 steps onto my perfectly manicured 3-inch-high fescue lawn, and that's when I heard the siren. It wasn't a typical police siren, that familiar yelp, yelp, yelp. This was a deep, guttural, chest-rattling wail, the kind of sound you associate with the end of the world or the arrival of something deeply serious. A massive, matte black armored van, the size of a small RV, screeched around the corner onto our quiet, sleepy street. It moved with an unnatural speed and agility for a vehicle its size. On the side, in stark white, block letters, it didn't say SWAT, it didn't say police, it said FSCC, Mobile Command and Signal Integrity Unit. The van slammed to a halt directly in front of my house, its brakes hissing like a dragon. Doors slid open, and men began to pour out. They were dressed in black tactical uniforms, all sharp creases and Velcro, with FSCC patches on their shoulders. They carried strange-looking antennae, bulky electronic cases, and devices that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. They didn't look at Brenda, who had stopped on her lawn, and was now watching with a placid, vaguely curious expression. They didn't look at the other neighbors who were starting to peek out from behind their curtains. They walked with purpose, straight towards my house, straight towards me. The lead agent, a tall man with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite, raised his arm and pointed directly at me. I stood there, frozen on my lawn, the furious tirade I had prepared dying in my throat. All I could manage to get out was a single, choked whisper to the universe at large. "You have got to be kidding me." The man with the granite jaw, whose name I would learn was Agent Miller, approached me with the calm, unhurried demeanor of a man who deals with existential threats on a daily basis. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He just looked at me with an expression of intense, analytical curiosity. "Sir," he said, his voice a low, even baritone, "I'm going to need you to come with me and have a seat on the curb." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, like, "The sky is blue," or "Water is wet." I was being detained, but not in the way you see on TV. I wasn't a criminal. I was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit, an unexpected variable in a very important equation. My rage had evaporated, replaced by a surreal, out-of-body bewilderment. "What? Why?" I stammered, gesturing wildly between my house and Brenda's. "She did it! She cut my internet! She was right there with wire cutters!" Agent Miller's eyes didn't even flicker in Brenda's direction. She was now standing on her porch, sipping from a tall glass of what looked like lemonade, the picture of detached innocence. The smugness radiated off her in palpable waves. "Sir, please," Miller repeated, gently but firmly taking my elbow. "On the curb." He led me to the edge of my own lawn, and I sat, the dewy grass soaking through the seat of my pants. 2 other agents, both with the same grim, focused expressions, entered my house without a warrant, as if they owned the place. Another team was already sweeping the exterior with what looked like oversized Geiger counters. "Sir," Miller said, crouching down to my level. His eyes were like 2 gray stones. "We've detected a significant disruption in a federally monitored spectrum. A powerful, focused burst, followed by an abrupt termination of the signal. It originated from this location. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. We need to ask you about your transmission equipment. I think my brain broke a little bit. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish. My transmission equipment? I finally squeaked, my voice cracking. My transmission equipment is a Linksys router and a deep-seated love for fast download speeds. She cut my fiber line with garden shears. She's the one you should be talking to. Ask her. I pointed a shaking finger at Brenda, who took a delicate sip of her lemonade. Miller didn't even turn his head. It was at that moment a standard-issue police cruiser, looking comically small and old-fashioned next to the black behemoth of the FSCC, rolled up to the scene. Out stepped a man who was the platonic ideal of a small-town cop. He was in his late 50s, with a comfortable paunch, a gray mustache, and a seen-it-all attitude that was practically a part of his uniform. His name tag read Dave. Officer Dave surveyed the scene. The armored truck, the men in black, me sitting on my own curb like a naughty schoolboy, and ambled over. "All right, what's all this then?" he asked Miller, his tone relaxed and conversational. "We get a call about a neighborhood kerfuffle, and I find Uncle Sam's party van parked on the front lawn. Someone forget to pay their taxes?" Miller gave Officer Dave a look that could freeze water. "This is a federal matter, officer. We have it under control." "A federal matter in the Meadows?" Dave chuckled, unimpressed. "The biggest federal matter we usually have is when someone puts the wrong kind of mulch around their azaleas." He looked down at me, a glimmer of recognition and weary sympathy in his eyes. He leaned in conspiratorially. "Let me guess," he said, his voice low. "The HOA?" All I could do was nod numbly. My capacity for speech had been exhausted. "Thought so," he sighed, straightening up. A few minutes later, Agent Miller's radio crackled. He listened intently, then stood. One of the agents from inside my house emerged, carrying my beautiful, high-gain satellite dish as if it were a captured enemy flag. He held it out for Miller to inspect. Miller turned back to me. "Mr. Peterson, is this your device?" "Yes, it's not even hooked up," I protested. "It's for my job. I need a better connection than the garbage they offer out here." Miller ignored my outburst. He looked from the dish to me, then back to the dish. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place in his head. "The disruption wasn't from a transmission," he said almost to himself. "It was the termination of a reception." He finally looked over at Brenda, then back at me. A flicker of something, not quite understanding, but a recalculation, crossed his face. He explained. It turned out Brenda's husband, a man named Harold Butterfield, wasn't just some guy. He was the deputy director of the Federal Secure Communications Commission. The FSCC, he explained, was a little-known but critically important agency responsible for ensuring signal purity for national security infrastructure. This included, among other things, a top-secret deep space listening project called Project Echo, which used a network of highly sensitive dishes to scan for, well, he didn't say what they scanned for. The satellite dish I had bought, while perfectly legal and commercially available, happened to operate on a frequency band that was immediately adjacent to a restricted, encrypted channel used by Project Echo. My dish, even while inactive and just sitting in my house, was passively receiving and grounding a faint amount of signal bleed from their network. When Brenda cut my fiber line, she also severed the grounding wire for my entire home's electrical system, which was bonded to the utility box. This caused a momentary but massive electromagnetic pulse to radiate from my uninstalled dish, a significant disruption that lit up a dozen alarms in a concrete bunker somewhere in rural Virginia. Brenda hadn't just complained to the HOA. She'd seen the dish through the garage window, recognized it from her husband's work, and filed an official report with his agency about a rogue, high-gain transmission array of unknown origin compromising a national security channel. She had weaponized federal bureaucracy. She had, in essence, called in a drone strike on a parking ticket violation. I sat on the curb, my mind reeling. Officer Dave, who had listened to the entire explanation with a look of growing astonishment, came over and clapped a hand on my shoulder. He leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly whisper filled with a strange kind of admiration. "Son," he said, shaking his head slowly, "you didn't just poke the HOA bear. You poked the bear's husband, who, it turns out, is in charge of all the other bears." The Federal Secure Communications Commission did not apologize. Agencies like the FSCC don't do apologies. After another hour of scanning my house for any other reality-destabilizing electronics and determining that my greatest technological threat was a toaster with a bagel setting, they packed up their scary-looking gear and prepared to leave. Agent Miller handed me back my satellite dish with the air of a man returning a rabid raccoon. "We're confiscating this as evidence," he said flatly. "You'll be contacted by our legal department." He then gave me a stern 10-minute lecture on the federal regulations governing broadcast spectrums, most of which I was too dazed to comprehend. The gist was, don't even think about it. Then, just like that, they were gone. The black van disappeared around the corner, leaving behind only the faint smell of ozone and a profound sense of violation. I was left standing on my lawn, humiliated, internetless, and staring at the smugly triumphant face of Brenda Butterfield, who was still on her porch, having finished her lemonade and moved on to what looked like an iced tea. She gave me a tiny, triumphant little wave. She had won. An hour later, a beat-up utility truck from the local cable provider rumbled up to the curb. Out hopped a grizzled, wiry man in his late 50s named Sal. He had a magnificent mustache, a tool belt that had seen more action than most soldiers, and the weary eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss of customer service for 3 decades. He took one look at the neatly severed fiber optic cable hanging from my utility box. He didn't even need to ask. "Yep," he grunted, shaking his head. "She snipped it good. Seen this before?" He looked at me, then gestured with his chin towards Brenda's house. "HOA dispute?" I just nodded, the full weight of my defeat settling on me. "A different breed, these people," Sal muttered, pulling a pair of pliers from his belt. "Think that little binder gives them superpowers. All right, that'll be $300 to resplice. And I gotta tell you, it's an emergency call-out fee, so the price is firm." As he deftly began stripping and prepping the delicate wires, I couldn't help myself. The whole story just came pouring out of me. The move-in, the beige, the Necronomicon, the brushed bronze doorbell, the satellite of sin, the FSCC, the men in black, Agent Miller's granite jaw, Harold Butterfield and Project Echo, the lemonade, the smug little wave. I vented for a solid 10 minutes, a torrent of frustration and disbelief. Sal worked silently, listening intently. He crimped a wire here, twisted a connection there. When I finally ran out of steam, sputtering to a halt, he finished his work, closed up the utility box, and wiped his hands on a rag. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice a low conspiratorial rumble. "The woman is a stickler for the rules, right? She lives and dies by that binder of hers? She'd cite me for breathing in a non-uniform rhythm if she could," I said bitterly. Sal chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. "Huh. See, that's where you went wrong, kid. You've been trying to get around the rules. You were looking for loopholes. Amateurs look for loopholes." He leaned against his truck, crossing his arms. "The trick isn't to break the rules, it's to follow them." He paused for dramatic effect, his grin widening. "To follow them so hard it makes her cry." A tiny spark ignited in the cold, dead ashes of my soul. What do you mean? I mean malicious compliance, Sal said, his eyes twinkling. The most beautiful form of revenge there is. It's an art form. And that book, he gestured towards my house where the binder sat on my kitchen table, is your paint set. The next thing I knew, the two of us were in my garage. The Necronomicon was spread open on a dusty workbench like a sacred text. Sal, who it turned out had a near photographic memory for petty regulations from his years of dealing with dozens of different HOAs, was flipping through it with the practiced ease of a scholar. I had a yellow highlighter. A new kind of energy was coursing through me. It wasn't rage anymore, it was inspiration. I'm a tech guy, a systems guy. The HOA wasn't a social contract, it was a badly written piece of code, full of bugs and exploitable subroutines, and I was about to hack the hell out of it. Okay, look at this, Sal said, stabbing a calloused finger at a page. Section 42, Lawn Ornaments. A maximum of 5 anthropomorphic decorative figures are permitted, not to exceed a height of 2 feet. He looked up at me, his eyebrows raised. It doesn't say what kind of figures. Doesn't say they gotta be cute little bunnies, does it? My own grin started to emerge. No, I said slowly. No, it does not. And here, I said, pointing with my highlighter. Holiday decorations. Page 112. Decorative displays for federally recognized holidays may be erected no more than 60 days prior to the holiday and must be removed no more than 30 days following the holiday. I looked at Sal, the spark in my soul turning into a flame. It doesn't specify which holiday. Sal slapped the workbench with a loud crack. Bingo! Who's to say you're not just really, really excited for Arbor Day or National Accordion Awareness Month? A plan began to form. A beautiful, terrible, and, most importantly, perfectly, unimpeachably legal plan. Brenda Butterfield wanted compliance? Oh, I was going to give her compliance. I was going to comply so hard it would shatter her beige-tinted view of the world forever. Sal was more than just a cable guy. He was a revolutionary general who had been waiting for the right war. He got on his phone, and within an hour, he had assembled a team. A crew of seasoned contractors who, I quickly learned, all shared a deep, abiding, and philosophical hatred of homeowners' associations. They were the A-team of malicious compliance. First to arrive was Marco, the landscaper. He was a short, stocky man with a wild mane of black hair and dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails. He took one look at my pristine HOA-approved lawn and shook his head in disgust. Sal made the introductions. Marco, this is Alex. Alex Marco. Alex wants to redo his lawn. He wants something that meets the bylaws, but that will give Brenda Butterfield a splitting headache every time she looks out her window. Marco's face broke into a huge grin. Ugly but native? My specialty, he boomed. Bylaw usually says you gotta use regionally appropriate flora. They mean pretty flowers. But you know what else is regionally appropriate? Thistle, crabgrass, spiky yucca plants that look like something out of a sci-fi nightmare. I can make your lawn look like a Mad Max desert scene that a botanist would have to approve of. It'll be hideous. And it'll be perfect. Next came Lenny, the painter. A lanky, soft-spoken man who smelled faintly of turpentine. Sal showed him the approved color palette in the Necronomicon. Brenda hates color, I explained. The whole neighborhood is in shades of greige and depressing taupe. Lenny ran a long finger down the list of approved paint colors. Ah, but look here, he whispered, pointing to a couple of swatches at the bottom of the page, clearly added in a moment of madness by some long-forgotten committee. Approved accent colors, faded salmon and sickly pea green, my God, He looked up, his eyes wide with artistic horror and delight. She hates faded salmon? Oh, we can do faded salmon, with sickly pea green trim. Both are on the pre-approved palette, page 92. It will be an architectural abomination. Finally, there was Ricky, the electrician. He was young, hyperactive, and covered in tattoos of circuit diagrams. He listened to the holiday decoration loophole with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert. So 60 days before, 30 days after, he mused, tapping his chin. And it can be any federal holiday. Columbus Day, Veterans Day, President's Day. That gives us almost year-round coverage if we plan it right. He grinned, a manic glint in his eye. You want a holiday display? Kid, I can light this house up like a Vegas casino landing strip. I'm talking programmable RGBs, strobes, the works. It'll be so up to code the city inspector will weep with joy. It'll also be visible from the International Space Station. The onslaught began the next morning. It was a symphony of spite, a ballet of bureaucracy. Before any work started, I sat at my computer and filed the appropriate forms on the HOA's clunky online portal. Application for landscape modification. Application for exterior paint color change. Application for installation of decorative figures. I attached schematics. I cited the specific bylaws, complete with page and paragraph numbers. I hit submit on each one and received an automated email receipt. I was creating an unassailable paper trail. Then the army descended. Marco's team arrived with a sod cutter and ripped up my perfect fescue lawn, rolling it up like a cheap carpet. In its place, they planted a hellscape of drought-resistant native plants. Spiky yuccas stood like angry sentinels. Scraggly sagebrush filled the gaps. And everywhere there were clumps of a particularly ugly ornamental grass that grew in chaotic, depressing tufts and was a lovely shade of brown for 11 months of the year. While they worked, Marco carefully placed the lawn ornaments. Per section 42, there were 5. A 2-foot-tall gnome, snarling and holding a tiny electric guitar, the death metal gnome. Another one, pale and groaning with a chunk of its hat missing, the zombie gnome. A classic gray alien with huge black eyes, a gnome dressed like a plague doctor. And for the centerpiece, a Cthulhu figurine, its tentacles poised to drag the entire neighborhood down into a watery abyss of madness. They were hideous. They were under 2 feet tall, and they were perfectly compliant. Meanwhile, Lenny's crew had power washed the house and were applying the first coat of faded salmon. It was a color that defied description. Not quite pink, not quite orange, but a nauseating, chalky fusion of the two. Brenda, who had been watching the landscaping with a look of growing horror, actually stumbled back a step when the first stripe of sickly pea green was applied to the trim around the windows. It was the color of baby food that had gone bad. My house was quickly becoming an eyesore that could be seen from space, and every excruciating detail was pre-approved. I watched from my front window, sipping my coffee, a feeling of profound, righteous joy swelling in my chest. This was better than revenge. This was art. The masterstroke, the grand finale of our suburban opera, came from Sal. He had spent another night with the Necronomicon, searching for the ultimate weapon. He found it on page 173, in a dusty, forgotten addendum from the 1990s. Section 78, Ancillary Structures. He read to me over the phone, his voice filled with reverence. Each property is permitted the installation of 1 decorative flagpole, not to exceed a height of 20 feet. I didn't understand. A flagpole? Sal, I'm not trying to be patriotic. I'm trying to be a menace. You're not thinking with portals, kid, he said. It says a decorative flagpole. It doesn't say you have to fly a flag. and it doesn't say what the pole can be made of, or what can be on it. The next day, a truck delivered a 20-foot, commercial-grade aluminum flagpole. We planted it right in the center of my new Mad Max-themed front yard, sinking its base in a cubic yard of concrete. It was defiant, phallic, and utterly glorious. Then, Ricky the electrician went to work. Citing the holiday display loophole, we were now in the 60-day run-up to Flag Day, naturally, he and his apprentice spent an entire afternoon wrapping the entire pole from base to tip in thousands upon thousands of feet of programmable RGB LED strips. They wired it all back to a controller box tucked discreetly behind a particularly spiky yucca. That evening, the entire crew, Sal, Marco, Lenny, and Ricky, gathered on my porch. The sun had just set. The faded salmon paint glowed with a sickly luminescence in the twilight. The zombie gnomes seemed to stare hungrily at Brenda's house across the street. "You ready?" Ricky asked, holding up a remote control. "Do it," I said. He pressed a button. The flagpole exploded into light. It wasn't just on, it was alive. It cycled through a rainbow of obnoxious, strobing colors, a pillar of pure, unadulterated visual noise. It pulsed, it shimmered, it flashed patterns of neon green and electric magenta that were probably illegal in several countries. But that wasn't the best part. Tucked inside the LED housing, running the entire length of the pole, was a custom-built, long-range Wi-Fi antenna I had designed myself. It was my digital middle finger to Brenda Butterfield and the FSCC. I held up my phone. The Wi-Fi symbol was lit up. I had 2 bars. It wasn't fiber, but it was mine. "It's glorious," Marco whispered, a tear in his eye. Brenda's meltdown was not long in coming. The violation notices started the next morning, delivered by email every hour on the hour. Unauthorized light display. Unapproved structure. Violation of aesthetic harmony. I replied to each one, attaching a PDF of my pre-approved forms and a screenshot of the relevant bylaw. She called Officer Dave. He showed up, his cruiser looking even more tired in the shadow of my throbbing, luminous flagpole. He looked at my paperwork. He looked at the pole. He looked at Brenda, who was vibrating with rage on her lawn. "Ma'am," Dave said with a heavy sigh, "it's all in order. It's ugly as sin, and it's giving me a migraine just looking at it, but it's legal. My hands are tied." Finally, in a desperate, last-ditch effort, she called her husband. I can only imagine that phone call. I picture Harold Butterfield, a man in charge of protecting the nation's most sensitive communications, getting an earful from his wife about his neighbor's tacky Christmas lights in June. I found out later from a sympathetic neighbor that Harold, who was already in hot water with his superiors over the mobilizing a federal tactical unit for a suspected HOA violation incident, told her in no uncertain terms to drop it. The LED display was low power, wasn't broadcasting on any restricted frequencies, and he would rather face an actual alien invasion than deal with another one of her neighborhood squabbles. She was checkmated, beaten at her own game with her own rules. Defeated on the battlefield of bylaws, Brenda retreated to her last bastion of power, the HOA meeting. She called an emergency session at the community clubhouse. The email, sent to the entire neighborhood, promised a discussion on protecting our community standards and property values from aggressive and inappropriate modifications. The meeting was packed. Apparently, my little protest had become the hottest ticket in town. I walked in with Sal, who had insisted on coming for moral support, and found a seat in the back. The room was buzzing. Brenda stood at a podium at the front, looking severe and resolute. She banged a gavel. "This emergency meeting of the Meadows Homeowners Association will now come to order." She launched into a passionate, trembling speech about harmony, uniformity, and the sacred sanctity of beige. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. She spoke of certain elements who sought to make a mockery of their shared values. She pointed out the window towards my house, which, even from a distance, glowed with a faint, salmon-colored aura. "He is destroying the aesthetic harmony of our community," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "He is thumbing his nose at the very rules that protect us, that make this neighborhood a desirable place to live. This flagrant disregard for our standards cannot be allowed to stand." When she finished, there was a smattering of applause from a few of her loyal cronies in the front row. Then, all eyes turned to me. A slow, evil grin spread across my face. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stood up. "May I respond, Madam President?" Brenda's eyes narrowed, but she couldn't refuse. "You may." I walked to the front of the room, holding my phone. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke calmly, reasonably, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Ma'am, I'm not mocking the rules," I began, making eye contact with the other residents. "On the contrary, I am celebrating them. Every single action I've taken, the paint, the landscaping, the gnomes, the flagpole, has been in strict, documented adherence to the covenants you yourself instructed me to read on my first day here." I paused, letting that sink in. "I have filed every form. I have cited every bylaw. I am, by definition, the perfect resident." Then I played my trump card. "You speak of a flagrant disregard for our standards, but let's talk about the standards of how we treat our neighbors." I held up my phone and read her email about my security doorbell, my polite request, and her cold, bureaucratic refusal. I read it aloud in a neutral, non-emotional tone. Then I said, "And when that wasn't enough, when a simple disagreement over a doorbell escalated, my fiber optic line, my connection to my job, to the outside world, was deliberately severed with a pair of wire cutters." A wave of murmurs went through the room. People were looking at each other, then at Brenda. Her face had gone pale. "And when I came out to see what happened," I continued, my voice steady, "I wasn't met with an apology. I was met with a federal tactical team called in under false pretenses because my choice of internet hardware was deemed inconvenient." The murmuring grew louder. My next-door neighbor, a quiet man I'd only ever nodded to, stood up. "Is that true, Brenda? Did you cut his line?" Brenda stammered. He was violating the rules. That satellite dish was a threat." "It was in a box in my garage," I countered. Suddenly, the room had turned. It wasn't about my ugly house anymore. It was about Brenda's abuse of power. A motion was raised from the floor by a woman in the back. Not to punish me, but to hold a vote of no confidence in Brenda Butterfield's leadership. The motion passed by an overwhelming margin. Brenda stood at the podium, utterly defeated, as her beige empire crumbled around her. The new HOA president, elected by a landslide 15 minutes later, was a laid-back guy named Tom, whose entire platform was allowing gas grills on patios and lowering the fine for leaving your recycling bin out for more than 12 hours. The revolution was over. We had won. A week later, I was sitting on my front porch. The house was still a jarring combination of faded salmon and sickly pea green. The zombie gnome was still staring blankly at the street, a silent, decaying sentinel. My glorious 20-foot flagpole was slowly cycling through a soothing, deep blue light, a beacon of my hard-won liberty. Sal was there, sitting in the other chair, a can of beer in his hand. We were watching Brenda's moving truck being loaded up across the street. She and Harold had put the house on the market the day after the meeting. It had sold in 2 days. I held up my phone. The Wi-Fi symbol was shining brightly. 2 strong bars of mediocre but deeply personal internet. I took a long sip of my own beer. It tasted like victory. Sal clinked his can against mine. "So," he said, a grin in his voice, "was it worth it?" I looked at my hideous, beautiful, defiant house. I looked at the moving truck across the street. I thought about the sheer, soul-crushing terror of seeing that black van and the pure, unadulterated joy of watching Brenda's face as her own rules were read back to her. I took another sip and smiled. "You know what?" I said. "Totally worth it.